Oof, that is a deep, complex question with a lot of variables and a lot of answers. So we have a lot of, class division, which is a huge problem, specifically between blue-collar workers and progressives who used to be on the same side not that very long ago. There's nothing more socialist and ACAB than a real redneck. The original rednecks were the Scottish Covenanters, a progressive group in the 1600s, and after immigrating to the United States, they became coal miners, and they brought with them the tradition of wearing a red bandana around their neck to identify who was a comrade. That kind of comrade. The term redneck in the United States originated from them after the coal mine wars, where they went to stack capitalist bodies and their cop lapdogs. And then they went and formed a bunch of unions. So the unions and the socialist progressives, on the college campuses and everything, they were on the same side for a long time until the 1970s, when Nixon was deliberately able to divide union workers and intellectual progressives over pro and anti-war sentiment on Vietnam. So that's one of the biggest problems with our country today, is blue-collar workers voting against their own self-interest and their former allies because of their misunderstood idea of patriotism and America. Obviously, race relations in our country has had a long, rocky history, but our modern racial issues can really be traced back to Andrew Johnson. After the Civil War, instead of forcing the Confederate Karens to denounce all of their ties to the Confederacy or hang like the traitors that they were, he let them keep their treason rag, build a bunch of traitor trophies, and enact a bunch of segregation and Jim Crow laws, whitewash all of their history to pretend like the Civil War was about anything other than them committing treason so they could continue to own other human beings. And that's the reason why today we have all this racial tension and them bitching and crying as we take away their participation trophies. But even with all of that, the long arm of history always seemed like it arced towards equality and justice. That was until, 1980. In steps Reagan, and he basically single-handedly creates the Christian right. Prior to him, Christians in our country really had no political cohesion. They were not a political group, and they certainly were not a political base. In fact, many of them intended to vote very liberally. But at the time, he formed an alliance with Jerry Falwell and Bob Jones and people like that who were looking for some political sway so they didn't have to desegregate their fucking Christian schools. Yeah, that was actually still a thing. In the 70s and 80s, segregated schools still absolutely existed, for all of you assholes who think that, segregation is way in the past. Yeah, since it wasn't a real great look to package their message around help us keep schools segregated, they made up an issue that hadn't been an issue at all prior to this in the religious community. Abortion. Prior to the 1980 election, Christians didn't give a single solitary fuck about Roe v. Wade. But hey, a couple out of context Bible verses later, and they had a bunch of idiots galvanized around the idea that abortion was murder. And then was born the Christian right, a bunch of one-issue voters that have no idea what they're actually fucking voting for, but will vote that way for all eternity. Yeah, so if you're a pro-lifer, just remember that your whole political ideology is completely based on keeping black kids out of Christian schools. So, good fucking job. Anyway, those assholes got Reagan elected, and he went on to be awful in just every conceivable way. He enacted the worst economic policies in our nation's history that continue to haunt us today, cutting corporate and top earner tax rates to half of what they were during the economic booms of the 1950s, deregulating just about everything he could, from the FAA to the trucking industry, which all cost people's lives, union busting, doubling the deficit, slashing medical and mental health services, and just kicking people out on the streets. So the reason we have so many homeless people, and especially homeless veterans today. But yeah, that was Reagan. He had hugely damaging foreign policy, maybe not quite as bad as Truman, but fucking close, and definitely more affecting us today than Truman. From the Iran-Contra fiasco, to his atrocious handling of Cold War tensions, causing the Cold War to last years longer than it should have, to cutting a deal with Iran to keep American hostages held hostage until after the presidential election to help him win. All of that pales in comparison to his domestic and social damage. I mean, obviously, all of our wealth inequality, our economic problems, our kleptocracy that we live in, all that's owed to him. But more than that, he was responsible for the idea of the welfare queen, which was just, completely racist. He was incredibly anti-LGBTQ. He ignored the AIDS epidemic and caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. His own friend, Rock Hudson, appealed to him to help him get AIDS treatment in France because, America wasn't doing shit. Reagan turned his back on him and he died. He created the Republican alliance with the NRA, ironically, to pass gun control because, all gun control is racist, and he did not like the idea of black people having guns and using the Second Amendment for what it was literally intended for. Ultimately, the Christian right, the gun lobby, and his economic policies are the base, the foundation, the playbook for the modern Republican Party. Christian right and the gun lobby are ultimately what became the MAGA cult, and his economic policies are ultimately what are responsible for our low wages, our increasing debt, responsible for the union busting, for the dwindling social services, for all the deregulation, all the monopolies that have been allowed to form. It's responsible for Wall Street and the shareholder return business models. Almost every single modern problem we have today can be traced back to Reagan policies in some form or fashion. So if I had to narrow it all down to the one thing that's really wrong with this country, I would say it's that John Hinckley is a bad shot.